Hello and welcome to this timely briefing. I am Simon Lewis, Chief Executive at AFME, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's GFMA Members Briefing, Brexit, where are we now and what next? I'm speaking from our London offices, but we're pleased to be joined in this global briefing by more than 500 AFME, SIFMA and ASIFMA members from across the globe, Europe, the US and Asia. Together, our three groups comprise the GFMA, which represents the interests of our members globally. We are in the middle of another dramatic week in UK politics, and following today's announcement that the Parliamentary Conservative Party will hold a confidence vote on Prime Minister Theresa May's leadership this very evening, it's fitting that I'm joined by an expert panel, including Michael Prescott, Group MD, Corporate and Political Strategy at AFME's Communications Advisors, Hanover. Michael, who is a distinguished former political editor of the Sunday Times, will be providing insights on the politics behind the latest developments and what it means for the Brexit process. We're also joined by Chris Bates, Head of Financial Regulatory Practice at Clifford Chance, who will give an overview from a regulatory and legal perspective. AFME's Brexit team, Oliver Moulin and Arvid Cole, are also with us and will be contributing their expertise. Now, there'll be an opportunity at the end of this briefing for me to put some of your questions to the panel. You can submit questions at any point from now by clicking on the Q&A icon on the right-hand side of your screen and typing in your question. There's a lot of material to get through during the next hour, so I do apologise in advance if we're not able to get to all your questions. Before handing over to Michael Prescott, I'd like to make a few remarks about the latest developments and where they leave us on Brexit. We'd originally been expecting to discuss and digest the results of the planned vote in the UK Parliament on the Withdrawal Agreement. But of course, on Monday afternoon, the Prime Minister announced that she would be deferring the vote in light of the fact she was facing a very significant defeat in Parliament. So the Conservative Parliamentary Party will later this afternoon be holding a vote of confidence on the Prime Minister's leadership of the party in order for Theresa May to continue to be party leader. At least half of the Conservative Party membership Parliament, that's 158 out of 315 Conservative MPs, will need to support her in that crucial vote. It's clear that the so-called Irish backstop is an issue that's made it impossible for the Prime Minister to get her deal through the UK Parliament, and Michael Prescott will say more about this shortly. But the backstop, for those who aren't familiar with it, refers to the customs and trading arrangements which would come into force in order to prevent a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland in the event of the UK and the EU not being able to negotiate a trade deal by the end of December 2020. So, considerable uncertainty remains for businesses operating across Europe and internationally about if and when there'll be a Brexit deal and a transition period. AFME members are having to plan for the worst and hope for the best, with a number of significant cliff-edge risks still outstanding, which Chris Bates and Oliver Moulin will cover later on in this briefing. So, without further ado, I'll now hand over to Michael Prescott to explain what happens next and how events may pan out over the coming days and indeed the next 24 hours. Michael.
Simon, thank you, and thank you to everyone who's taken time to participate today. I know that we've had people dial in from, many of you from outside the UK, so I'm going to spend some time on some pretty basic fundamentals about British politics. But as Simon says, we've all tuned in on the day that the UK's governing party has decided to hold a confidence vote in and possibly remove our Prime Minister. Let me just pause immediately to remind you, our governing party is the Conservative Party, often referred to as the Tory Party or the Tories, and in our system, whichever party gets the largest number of MPs in our elected House of Commons forms the government, and that party's leader becomes Prime Minister. So if the Tory party sacks one leader and picks another, that new person automatically becomes the Prime Minister. And that's what people are speculating about today because of the confidence vote. The vote of confidence is amongst all 315 Tory MPs eligible to vote, as Simon mentioned. And in theory, Mrs May needs just 50% plus one to hold on to her job as Tory leader and Prime Minister. But of course, politics is never that simple. The real question is this: If 100 or more Tory MPs vote against Mrs May, can she hold on? Even Mrs May's supporters think there's a real prospect that she could have 100 or more votes against her. What's interesting is that Mrs May's such a tough woman, even with a sizable vote against her, she may choose to brass neck it and try to remain as leader and prime minister. And if she were to do that and get away with it, she could end this drama all the stronger. Because under the Tory party's rules, once a leader has survived a confidence vote, he or she cannot be challenged again for 1 year. So trying to remove Mrs May, those trying to remove Mrs May have to succeed today, or else they've strengthened her and she can continue in theory to be in charge of the Brexit process, almost certainly for the next year, as I shall go on to explain. Mrs May's cabinet is crucial in all this because if she does have a sizable vote against her, and if she does not automatically choose to go, then she'll in pretty short order have to sit down with her cabinet. And one of the big questions we'll all have to wonder about is, are they going to back her or in effect sack her? And if some of them want to sack her, some of them want to keep her, how will those dynamics play out? It's unlikely, having sustained, let's say, 100 or so MPs vote against her, that Mrs May could survive a mass walkout by her cabinet. So, make a long story short, she could survive today, only for us to find there's another drama with her cabinet, maybe tomorrow. Now, in a moment, I'm going to start looking forward to how Britain handles Brexit, whether that's under Mrs May or a successor, and I plan to spend a good 10 minutes or so on that, because we're not going to neglect our Brexit analysis because of this leadership crisis. However, before I turn to Brexit, because I suspect there's curiosity here, let me just take a moment to look at why we're having this confidence vote in Mrs May, and then look at who may get Mrs May's job and how. So first question, this drama today, why oh why is our governing party doing this to its leader? Well, as the Brits who are taking part in this webinar will know, there is within our governing Tory party a faction of hardcore Eurosceptics who want a very harsh form of Brexit. And in a parliamentary of just over 300 MPs, they number around 80 to 100, sizable minority. These people, they really dislike the way Mrs May has tried to negotiate a Brexit which could keep the UK in the EU single market and customs union or something close to it. They dislike her approach. Under the Tory party's rules, just 48 MPs are needed to trigger a confidence vote, and they've done so. The Eurosceptics' patience with Mrs May's attempts to push a form of soft Brexit has worn out, and yesterday, stroke today, they've moved against her. So as I've said, if even Mrs May's friends think there's a real chance she could be forced out, and if she does go, how is a new Tory leader chosen? Actually, the answer to that, thankfully, is pretty simple. Only Tory MPs can be a candidate for the top job, and any Tory MP who wants to run as a candidate for the leadership needs to be nominated by just 2 fellow Tory MPs. We are going to see a crowded field if Mrs May goes, probably 6 or more people running if there's a race. What happens next? Well, 2 votes per week are held, 2 ballots a week are held amongst Tory MPs. The bottom place candidate is knocked out each time. There's a possibility this series of knockout votes could be accelerated, and even that it could take place over Parliament's Christmas recess, which begins on December 20th. So ordinarily it's 2 ballots a week, could be faster this time round. The rules allow some flexibility. But essentially we get a load of knockout rounds amongst Tory MPs until we're left with 2 people standing. And the final 2 MPs then go before a ballot of all 124,000 grassroots Tory members. This is most likely to be a postal ballot. It's most likely to take a week or 2, but the Tory party rules are a bit vague on the specifics here. Nevertheless, when we look at it in the round, if Mrs May has to go, what we're likely to see is her hanging on a few weeks while this race takes place, and then a new leader taking office probably in mid or late January. Those of you wondering about how to factor into all this uncertainty into what you do for your day job, probably mid or late January for a new leader if the Prime Minister goes. Who will take Mrs May's job if she is going? Well, firstly, any of you who are taking part in this webinar who worry about Boris Johnson, you can relax, but you can only relax a little bit. The fact is, he does remain very popular amongst grassroots members of the Tory party. But, and it's a big but, Tory MPs are less keen on him. And it's by no means no more than my hunch. My current bets, top bets, would be Jeremy Hunt, our current Foreign Secretary, or possibly Dominic Raab, the guy who quit just, I think it was a few weeks ago, as our Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Right, that's the Tory party in its current travails, and if you want, we will be taking questions at the end. But I'm going to go on now to Brexit itself, and I want to analyse why this process of Brexit is proving so difficult that it's threatening our Prime Minister's job. And when I've done that, I'm going to look at what kind of Brexit we may end up with. So first question, what is the root of Britain's problem with deciding how to leave the EU? Well, the problem in short is that Britain is having trouble leaving the EU because of its troubled history with Ireland. And the fact that this history led to the so-called Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The Good Friday Agreement was in every sense a big deal. It ended a 30-year terrorist campaign which cost 3,500 lives. The campaign was conducted primarily by the IRA, whose key demand was for Britain to give up its territory of Northern Ireland and hand it over to the country next door, the Republic of Ireland. So, to end IRA terrorism, Britain, in 1998, agreed, amongst other things, to keep pretty much an open border between the British territory of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. So now fast forward 17 years, and Britain has an EU referendum, and we wind up, as a nation, voting for a contradictory policy. By backing Brexit, Britain voted in favour of throwing up new barriers between the UK and all other EU states, including the Republic of Ireland. So just pause, we actually should all be asking ourselves, which is it? Is Britain in favour of new barriers between itself and every EU state, including Ireland? Or is Britain in favour of leaving open its only land border with the EU by sticking to the Irish peace deal and its provisions about minimising barriers with the Republic of Ireland? Which is it? The answer, of course, is Britain wants it both ways. Thanks to the referendum, government policies to stand by the Irish peace deal and also pursue Brexit. Britain's policy contradicts itself. And frankly, most of our national leaders are in denial about this fact. The British politicians who are not in denial on this fact have tied themselves up in knots. You've seen this with Mrs May. They've been coming up with ideas about temporary open border agreements, common rule books, and of course the now infamous backstop. I focus on all this because let's be clear, and Simon mentioned this, the Irish backstop is the single biggest reason Mrs May cannot get her Brexit deal approved by British MPs so far. Brexit supporting MPs hate the idea of any part of the UK being stranded in the single market or the customs union, which is what the backstop will do, potentially. They won't, however, face up to the fact that any alternative to the backstop may risk breaching the Irish peace deal and putting new barriers on the island of Ireland. These MPs who are anti the backstop, anti Mrs May's deal, not facing up to realities about the Irish peace deal, they have a blocking minority in the UK Parliament. And that's in large part because our opposition parties won't back Mrs May's version of Brexit. Why won't they? Well, it's partly because the opposition parties simply want Mrs May's government to fall. They want a chance at power. It's partly because many of the opposition parties want soft Brexit and to remain in the single market rather than Mrs May's scheme. You put all that together, you begin to understand why, to use an English expression, the UK is in a right old pickle. So that's the backdrop, backstop I was going to say, that's the background to why we're in trouble. We have to ask what happens next. Regardless of whether Mrs May does go, and regardless of who succeeds her, whoever our Prime Minister is faces the same difficult options. And here they are on a slide, I hope. No, that one? Yes, thank you. Here they are on a slide. Now, unfortunately, there's no uncertainty over any of these options. Which option is the most likely is difficult to analyse, but I'm going to give it a go. Right now, if you ask most MPs privately, then what my colleagues and I are finding is, in the conversations we're having, is that the front-running option is the UK having another referendum. That's because none of the other options on this slide, which will reappear shortly, seem to command a majority in the UK House of Commons, aside maybe from Norway, which I'll come on to shortly. There's a growing view that to break the deadlock amongst our MPs, Brexit may have to go back before the people. Our MPs just don't seem to be able to agree on a way forward, a process made more difficult because the governing party lacks a majority. So what's being suggested by the woman on the slide that will reappear shortly, former Cabinet Minister Justine Greening, is a referendum. What would the question be in a referendum? No one has agreed yet. It could be Leave versus Remain. It could be Mrs May's deal versus hard Brexit. Or, and this idea is gaining ground, I think, it could be a two-part referendum. Vote on day one on whether you want to leave or remain. And if the vote is to leave, we repeat our desire to leave, then there'd be another vote maybe a week later on what type of Brexit we want. Now, as to whether Leave would win again, the polls in the UK at the moment suggest a narrow Remain victory next time round. But I have to caution you, remember, that's what the polls told us last time round. If we are going to get a referendum, we probably need the opposition Labour Party to support it, backed by other opposition parties, and maybe around 20 Tory MPs willing to go against the Brexit mainstream in their own party. When you break down the numbers, those numbers are there. Those numbers are there. But the people who support this idea of a referendum are currently debating when to make their move. And the current answer is simply not yet. Are we back on? So if we've dealt with referendum, what about that deal that Mrs May was trying to get through, and if she survives, will probably continue to get through? On balance, I would say the odds remain against this option of the deal Mrs May has been trying for. That's because so many MPs dislike the Irish backstop and the idea of no unilateral right to end the backstop. However, here's a funny caveat. If Mrs May wins today, ends up stronger, the odds on her getting her deal through probably increase, but I don't think they increase enough. If Mrs May, or maybe it's a successor, can't get that deal through, will they try to lead the UK out of the EU with no deal other than trading on World Trade Organization terms, as MPs like this man, Ian Duncan Smith, want? It's hard to see this happening. A majority of our 650 MPs fear the idea. If we wind up on the edge of a hard Brexit, then come March, when we're supposed to leave, then what many people think is that the majority in the House of Commons would assert itself. They'd stage a vote, probably uniting across party lines to pass a motion instructing whoever is Prime Minister to extend Article 50. Another idea being advanced comes from this man, Tory Minister Nick Bowles. Norway Plus, apply to EFTA, remain in the European Economic Area, thereby continuing to enjoy access to the single market. Top it up with a customs union to deal with the Irish border question. Lots of MPs like this solution. It's a bit of an off-the-shelf instant solution. Conservative Eurosceptics hate the idea of becoming a rule taker and having continued free movement of people. But I still say I think this is the second most likely outcome facing the country eventually. And I say that because remember, the UK's opposition parties claim to want single market, claim to want a customs union, and you only need a few Conservative MPs to side with them, and we could end up as a nation going forward in this direction. What about Boris and the hardcore Eurosceptics, the leavers who've made so much trouble for Mrs May and who advocate a Canada-style free trade agreement with the EU? The problem here is twofold. Firstly, it simply doesn't address the Irish border question. I told you at the start many UK politicians are in denial about this, and here's some of the evidence. Secondly, it means border queues and border checks on a scale that many fear would deter foreign investment in the UK. This path, Canada Plus, coming from our Eurosceptics, it enjoys only questionable support amongst the wider House of Commons. I think no majority in the House of Commons for it. And yet, here's the thing. In spite of my scepticism about Canada Plus, there's a chance you're going to be hearing a lot more about it. I say that because if Mrs May does go tonight or tomorrow with this vote of confidence, then anyone who wants her job has to play up to grassroots Tory party members in order to win the leadership race and succeed her. Most of the Tory grassroots members dislike the EU. They love the idea of a buccaneering Britain, free in theory to relinquish EU rules, free to do its own trade deals. So we could end up with a candidate playing to that gallery, winning a Tory leadership race and taking office committed to Canada Plus. My suspicion is we then end up watching that new Prime Minister struggle with the Irish border question just as we watched Mrs May. And I think we could have almost a repeat cycle of a Prime Minister banging their head against a wall. And sooner or later, as I've said earlier, maybe the referendum option coming to the fore. Lastly, people do wonder whether Britain's going to end up with an early general election. I tell you, I hope I can be clear here, I think that's very unlikely. We have a fixed term Parliaments Act. Under that law, the next election isn't due till 2022. To go early, 2/3 of our MPs have to back the motion. And right now, any Tory MP who went down that path would be like a turkey voting for Christmas. The other route to an early election is if a government loses a confidence vote in the full House of Commons twice within a fortnight. Even though the Tories lack an overall majority in our House of Commons, this is unlikely. Why? Well, you know what? It brings me back to where I began, which is issues to do with Northern Ireland. We have a small Northern Ireland party called the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP. They are likely to back the Tories in a Commons confidence vote under almost any circumstances and avert an early election. This is because they hate the idea of our opposition Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, winning an early election and becoming Prime Minister. And they hate that idea because Mr. Corbyn was pretty much an IRA sympathiser during the terror campaign I referred to at the start of my address. As things stand today, the DUP have said they'll help the Tory party survive any confidence vote. We'll all know by around 9 p.m. UK time today what the fate of our Prime Minister is to be, but I hope this has given you all useful context, useful explanation. Before I hand over to Chris, you'll see that there are a couple of other slides which you can access at your leisure after this session. The first one, I hope, is easy to follow. It gives you a detailed organogram of what might happen in our Parliament when Mrs May resumes business or a successor takes over. And the slide after that gives some interesting dates. I'm not going to spend time on it now, but if this country ends up extending Article 50, you're going to start hearing a lot in the UK about the next European elections and how on earth our parties organise for them. But for now, I'll leave it there.
Michael, thank you very much for that excellent and wide-ranging perspective, which was extremely helpful. I do apologise for the technical hitches during that presentation, but all the slides are available, as Michael said, for you to review at your leisure. It's now my great pleasure to hand over to Chris Bates from Clifford Chance to give us a wider legal and regulatory perspective. Chris, over to you.
The default position, as we know, if the UK can't agree an arrangement with the EU, is that the UK leaves the EU on the 29th of March without a deal. The question is what then are sort of the legal aspects of the pathway to some sort of alternative to that that Michael has sketched out. And the reason why people are so interested, obviously from a business point of view, is all the alternatives to no deal provide smoother waters in the foreseeable future. And that's because the draft withdrawal agreement, the one thing that pretty much everyone agrees in the draft withdrawal agreement and is not contested in any way, is the idea that there should be a transition, or as the UK call it, an implementation period, which lasts from the date the UK leaves the EU to the end of 2020, and in the latest version of the withdrawal agreement, be extended for 1 or 2 years beyond that by mutual agreement of the parties. So that creates the possibility of effectively no change. And it's important to understand that the transition period is a status quo transition. During that transition period, as sketched out, was spelled out in the draft withdrawal agreement, the UK is treated as if it were a member state for pretty much all practical purposes from a business perspective under EU law. So passporting continues, CCP recognition continues, all the things on which financial services business depend in the EU framework continue for the period, for that transition period. So that's when Simon says hope for the best, I think in the short term, that's the best. It's a continuation of the status quo. So how do we get there? Well, obviously we need a withdrawal agreement, and in the UK, there are various steps that have to be completed before we get there. So we need to have the withdrawal agreement laid before Parliament, needs to be approved in this meaningful vote, which was postponed. The House of Lords has to vote. And then we also need another act of Parliament in order to implement the withdrawal agreement as part of UK law. But the shape of that is pretty much broadly known because the government set it out in a white paper. And then finally, we have to have compliance with the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, which effectively gives Parliament a second vote, effectively to deny recognition of, deny ratification of the treaty. So that's the pathway. The Act also, very unusually, envisages what happens if you don't go there. I mean, this is really a sort of constitutional innovation, setting out what happens if you don't make a treaty. There's a sort of idea in it. And as you'll see if you're looking at the slides, it sets out 3 broad scenarios where you get a meaningful vote, doesn't pass, and then Parliament must vote. If the Prime Minister makes a statement that there's no agreement in principle on the withdrawal agreement, Parliament gets to vote. And if there's no agreement in principle, then Parliament gets to vote again. And the key dates, the second 2 scenarios, is 21st of January 2019. So more opportunities for Parliament to vote on whether it's going to have a deal. And the only sort of interesting thing that sort of happened in this, as regards this, is that Dominic Grieve proposed an amendment. Normally these motions are unamendable, and so effectively Parliament can sort of vote, and then the government can do what it was going to do. There was an amendment passed at the instigation of Dominic Grieve in the process a couple of weeks ago, which effectively means that Parliament, the House of Commons, can amend the vote on the denial of the withdrawal agreement, and that has no legal force, but obviously would have some political value. But I think this is all yet to come, because we, as Michael has said, we've still got a little way to go before we've got a government that knows what it's doing, and more to the point, whether it's going to get any substantive change to the agreement that it can take to Parliament to get these votes. So if we go on to the EU side, it's just worth reminding ourselves that the EU also has to ratify the agreement. I mean, it's sort of notable we spent all this time discussing UK politics as though the EU doesn't exist. I think that's been a particular fault of the UK debate on the whole Brexit issue, as somehow pretends the EU point of view, EU 27 point of view, doesn't exist. But it needs to vote. The European Parliament needs to consent to the treaty, the Withdrawal Agreement, and then the European the Council, acting by a qualified majority, can approve the agreement. At the moment, if the agreement goes forward in its current form, I don't think anybody thinks those steps are in doubt. If there are changes, it might get more interesting. So then there are two other possibilities which have sort of legal elements. One is extension of the negotiating period. The Article 50 envisages a hard 2-year deadline, which is why we end up with this 29th March date. But that can be extended by effectively unanimous decision of the European Council in agreement with the UK. So we need a UK EU agreement. Interestingly, there's a parliamentary process to this, because if the UK does, if the withdrawal date is extended, we need to amend the EU Withdrawal Act to amend the date of the exit day definition, and that requires approval of both houses of Parliament. You might be able to live without that in the short term, because in fact the relevant provision has not yet been brought into force. So you might manage to avoid crashing out without that in any event. Finally, and on these sort of issues around the pathways to smoother waters, of course, the pathway to the smoothest waters from most businesses' point of view, most financial sector business' point of view, is that Brexit doesn't happen at all. And the Court of Justice issued a decision on Monday, rushed through unexpectedly in terms of timing that they would rush this through, but it indicates their interest in current politics. A decision indicating that the UK could unilaterally revoke its Article 50 notice, a proposition that had been disputed by the European Commission and the other European institutions, who had argued that it required at least the consent of the European Council in order to do that. No, said the court, the UK can revoke the notice unilaterally, and if it does so, keep its exactly the same position as is today under the European treaties, all the derogations and opt-outs the UK has, so long as it takes the decision to revoke in accordance with its constitution, with the UK constitutional requirements, and delivers an unequivocal and unconditional notice to the European Council before the withdrawal agreement comes into force or the expiry of the negotiation period. The interesting point here is, how does the UK take that decision to revoke? Can the government do so on its own, or, as the Supreme Court decided in Miller, does it need an Act of Parliament to support its decision? And I think the balance is probably around that if you needed an Act of Parliament to serve the Article 50 notice, you almost certainly need an Act of Parliament to revoke the Article 50 notice. So that is an interesting constitutional debate. Now, that's all about smoother waters. The other more likely, or maybe more, I don't know whether we can say it's more likely, but the other outcome, of course, is no deal. And we are in the process of stepping up. I think everybody in the light of political turmoil and debate about the withdrawal agreement stepping up, no deal contingency planning. The Commission issued, on the EU side, the Commission issued a communication on contingency measures. Up to now, the Commission and the EU side has largely taken the position they're there to explain what the consequences of no deal are, but not to do anything to mitigate those consequences, even where those adverse consequences will fall on EU businesses. And in this communication, the Commission accepted that there were some things that it should do, in particular adopting conditional and time-limited equivalence decisions to enable UK CCPs and central securities depositories, central counterparties and securities depositories, to continue to be able to be used within the EU after a no-deal Brexit. And this has been contested as to whether they're going to act, And indeed, the reports are today that the Commission has indeed put these decisions in front of the European Securities Committee. So we may, if those reports are correct, see them published fairly shortly. Otherwise, at the EU level, there's not much going to be done. The ESAs, the European Supervisory Authorities, have proposed some measures to facilitate novations from UK of derivatives from UK to EEA counterparties, which might otherwise trigger clearing and margining requirements. They're saying we'll effectively put those on one side for 1 year post-Brexit to enable people to move business from the UK into the EU. But otherwise, at the EU level, not very much. Everything being pushed back down to the member states. And I think some of the member states are a bit surprised about this, that they're actually going to have to deal with some of the other consequences of a no deal. And so we're now seeing, in the last month or so, we're seeing proposals for national legislation to deal with no Brexit scenarios. At the moment, we have 5 countries that have made proposed legislation that we're aware of: Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands and Sweden, focusing in most cases on continuation of passporting or something similar to that. The French proposals, of course, and in many cases these proposals depend on secondary measures, so we don't know exactly what form the relief will take, but it seems to be focused on that. And then in some cases also on preserving the protection for UK based clearing and settlement systems from local insolvency laws, so that local banks can remain participants in those on a more straightforward basis. So we see that those pieces of legislation are going through. We also expect to see member states seeking cooperation agreements, put in place cooperation agreements with UK regulators. Be very helpful for the asset management industry because that facilitates delegations from EU asset managers to UK delegates, which is in many cases the proposed business model. And we may see member states using some of their other powers. Some member states like Italy and Germany, the regulators have powers to give cross-border licenses or waivers, which might be another means of mitigating the impact of a no deal on cross-border activity. On the UK side, and I'll just talk briefly about this before handing over to Oliver and Ave, we have more legislation. We have the European Union Withdrawal Act, which we've already mentioned, the EWA, which is the onshoring legislation, which effectively turns on exit day, on the day the UK leaves, turns EU law into domestic law, but gives the government power to adopt all sorts of statutory instruments to effectively address all the issues that would cause, because obviously in many cases that legislation wouldn't work effectively if once the UK is outside the EU. And we also now have another piece of proposed legislation, the Financial Services Implementation Legislation Bill, the In-Fights File Bill, which also gives the government, aims to give the government powers to adapt UK legislation to affect changes to UK legislation, EU legislation after exit day. So things like the risk reduction package, the CRR2 and CRD5, and other pieces like prospectus regulation or securities financial transaction reporting or EMIR refit, all these other things that are going on in the EU. The government would have the power for 2 years to effectively keep UK law in line with EU law for that period. On the onshoring process, some considerable progress made, about 30 instruments in total, some made, some published, waiting to be made, about 50 more to come. There's clearly a very strong pipeline there, which I think we will expect to see more of, and people know that's very complicated. But the main point from a practical point of view is we have transitional provisions made which give relief to firms to smooth that exit. And then at the same time, the delegation of powers to regulators has been done, and we have the extensive consultation papers from the UK regulators. And I think the only point to note on these before handing over is to say that these powers aim to minimise the change for firms as a result of Brexit, but they don't eliminate the need for action. So firms still need to opt in to the transitional provisions if they want to do so. third country CCPs need to opt into the transitional provisions if they need to do so, if they want to do so. And other actions need to be taken, client communications, new provisions in contracts under Article 5, disclosures of status disclosures and the like. So it's quite, the idea we can try to keep things the same, but we cannot keep things exactly the same. Firms need to act. And so with that, I'll hand over to Ola.
Thank you very much, Chris. And just to say once again that if anyone on the line or on the webinar rather has a question or topic they'd like to raise, please let us know, because we will have some time at the end for a broader panel discussion. Yes, now handing over to Oliver Moulin, who runs our Brexit activities in AFME, for an update on what we at AFME have been focusing on and will focus on going forward. Oliver, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. Before turning to our work, I thought it was worth spending a minute just to reflect on what was agreed in relation to financial services in the Withdrawal Agreement and the political declaration on the future relationship, because this tends to get a bit lost in the political noise and uncertainty that we've discussed. So as Chris mentioned, the Withdrawal Agreement itself, there were changes to include the ability to jointly extend the transition period once. So the parties could potentially extend the transition period up until the end of 2022. So beyond the transition that was agreed to 2020, there is the ability to have a longer period there if the parties jointly so agree. In relation to the political declaration, this contains some additional details on financial services. So as expected, given the UK's negotiating position, financial services access will be provided under an equivalence-based framework, ensuring autonomy of decision-making for both parties and also autonomy over their own regulation. However, there is an important commitment in the political declaration, which, remember, is non-binding, but of course politically is significant. There is an important commitment there to commence equivalence assessments under the existing framework as soon as possible after the UK has left on 29th of March, and an objective of having those concluded by June 2020, so sufficiently in advance of the end of the transition period to avoid a cliff edge at the end of the transition period. There's also a little bit more detail there around changes that would be contemplated to the existing equivalence framework, in particular around a commitment to increase transparency and consultation in the equivalence process, including in relation to any withdrawal of equivalence. However, there's notably nothing on the scope of equivalence, and I think this is still to be developed further once the UK has left, assuming this deal does go ahead. Perhaps turning to AFME's work streams, so Brexit remains a key priority for AFME, and it's clearly a key issue for a number of all our members. I'll provide a brief update on our work. Our key focus over the last year really has been on the no-deal preparations, as one of the issues that Chris has raised. We have done a number of publications, including on issues such as contract continuity, and that has remained a sort of key focus for us over the last year. I think given the ongoing uncertainties we've discussed today, this continues to be our key focus at the moment, and we've stepped up our advocacy across the EU and the UK stakeholders, including the Commission, the ECB, ESAs, regulators, and now increasingly at member state level as well. We've seen some progress and willingness to engage, I would say, in particular over the last couple of months from regulators and the Commission, and obviously the UK side perhaps was a bit more advanced in terms of engaging on the solutions for these issues. As Chris highlighted, we've now had a communication from the Commission, and that's helpful in confirming that it would adopt temporary equivalence decisions for UK CCPs and CSDs. We wrote to the Commission last week along with other associations calling for more details and certainty on the solution there to ensure that the CCPs have enough comfort and do not have to start their offboarding processes later this month. And again, as Chris mentioned, we are hearing that the Commission is now more advanced in that planning for issuing the temporary equivalence decision. So we should see something potentially later today or in the near future. However, on other issues such as continued servicing of existing uncleared derivatives, we're now in the place where, in light of the Commission's communication and lack of EU-level action, we're focusing on advocating for national solutions at member state level. As Chris mentioned, we've seen some progress here as well, with a number of member states now coming forward with measures that they are considering, and I think that will continue to be an area of focus for us. For example, we're in Italy tomorrow. Alongside that work, our product committees are increasingly analysing the practical implications of a no-deal plans, and we've engaged with the regulators on issues such as their approach to authorisation requirements, what booking models will be permissible both on day one in a no-deal scenario and in a sort of steady state longer term. There's also a significant exercise underway across AFME to respond to the EU Withdrawal Act's draft legislation and changes to the regulators' handbooks. And I think that will continue over the next few months. So in conclusion, I expect to continue our focus on no-deal preparations, and that to be our priority as the political uncertainty continues. If and when a deal is agreed, we're also turning our heads to develop a position on the future relationship, and in particular looking at the EU equivalence process and how that framework should be adapted, in particular to deal with the UK. So perhaps I'll stop there, Simon, and we can move to any questions.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And yes, we continue our focus very much on these cliff edge risks, which are still near present. So I've got a few comments in already. I'm going to cluster these and ask Michael and Chris to comment. So a few questions about the possibility of a second referendum or people's vote. I think, Michael, a question there would be, just in terms of timing, how practical might that be? A question about whether one possible outcome is some sort of national coalition government in the UK. Interesting your views on that. Chris, an interest in Article 50, and given it's been untested, is it actually going to be straightforward if there's going to be, the UK asks an extension of Article 50? And then a question about the contingency measures that have been announced by the Commission, and quote unquote, how legally certain will that now be? So perhaps I could, first of all, Michael, ask you to comment briefly on those two topics that have been raised.
Yes, certainly. On when we would have a second referendum, if we were to have one, let's put it this way. If the decision were made before Christmas or very early in the new year, unlikely, but bear with me as an illustration, we would probably end up having that referendum in June. We've got a detailed paper at Hanover on why this is, but if you look at the time taken to pass legislation at the last time round, it gives you a good guide. Could we go faster than last time round? Unlikely, because actually there's less consensus this time round, both about having a referendum and about the questions. We also have here in this country something called the Electoral Commission, which wishes to, and I think may, in legal terms, may be empowered to test the question, do focus groups on the question so that we don't end up with a silly question that confuses people. So when you put all that together, we are looking at the summer. The first estimate we had in was August, but you can't, I don't think any government would try and have a referendum in the holiday season when so many people are abroad. And I do think the politicians would be under pressure to speed things up. So ballpark June, we think, on the timing. Do you want me to go on to coalition government?
Yes, if you could.
On coalition government, I do not see that being in prospect in the short or medium term. This country does not have a great tradition of national governments. It barely has a tradition of coalition governments because our voting system tends to, some might say, deliberately distort election outcomes in order to make sure we have a government with a big majority. That hasn't worked out in the last few elections. The current government is just shy of a coalition. They're not in coalition with the DUP, that Northern Irish party I mentioned earlier, but they've got what's called a confidence and supply agreement where the DUP agree to support our Conservative government on crucial votes. I know what's behind your question. it's very hard to see how we get to a government of national unity. I said earlier, I think an early general election is very unlikely. So the idea probably is halted right there. The idea this House of Commons would somehow put aside its differences, what we'd get would be one stop away from what you are hinting at. I mentioned this earlier. If we were to have a referendum, a second referendum, we might well get it by MPs coming together across party lines and forcing it upon our minority Conservative government. That's a little bit different to having a government of national unity.
Thank you, Michael. Chris, Article 50 and the contingency measures.
So the extension of Article 50 of the negotiating period is in theory quite straightforward. You need the agreement of the UK and you need the unanimous agreement of the European Council. How difficult is that? Well, it could be quite difficult because people are very concerned that extending the period, particularly if it goes out to June, would mean that the UK would have to participate in the European elections, European Parliament elections, which are scheduled for May, which would mean electing MEPs, and not dealing with that would be quite complicated. The government itself would have its own political difficulties about whether it needed, how it would mobilise parliamentary support for it. I mean, in theory, this is a foreign government action it could take on its own, but maybe there'll be more litigation even over that. And clearly, many opportunities for further political upset in that. I mean, not least because people then think, do we change the withdrawal agreement or do we just have a shorter implementation or transition period? So you can see many other consequences flow out from that. On the next question on how legally certain are the Commission measures, well, of course, we have yet to see them formally. They're expected, as Simon said, to be published relatively soon. In principle, this is a relatively simple idea that the Commission declares the UK system equivalent. I think it had been controversial whether the Commission was prepared to act before Brexit. It had previously said that it was not, there were legal, I mean, never actually explicitly said this, but the implications were that there were legal obstacles to taking equivalence decisions with respect to a country that wasn't yet a third country. And so, if Brexit reports are to be believed, then it sounds as though they've overcome those legal obstacles and have decided go ahead with some form of recognition, which we know will be temporary and conditional in some form. Of course, that's not the only thing to solve the CCP recognition problem. You still have to, ESMA still has to recognise those CCPs, so it has to also to be prepared to act. We want to make this truly seamless before exit day to enable the recognition to take effect, and that in itself depends on further conditions, in particular the negotiation of a cooperation agreement with the UK authorities on exchange of information in relation to those CCPs and CSDs. So you can see there's still other steps to be taken, but in principle, once you overcome the idea that you're not able to act before exit day, then that should those obstacles should fall away, and it should be hopefully possible to give the market the certainty that it wishes to have about the extension, the continuation of recognition with all that entails for ongoing clearing, GCCP treatment for capital, and all the other consequences of the UK recognition of the EU recognition of UK CCPs. Of course, there are a lot of other things to be done, as we said, on the national level, whatever. But I think this one was the one in which both sides agreed there was actually a systemic issue, and both sides agreed there really was no other way around this problem, because moving the vast volume of derivatives from potentially affected derivatives to new homes was just out of the question in any practical sense.
Thank you, Chris. I think this is probably next question for Oliver. It sounds like it might come from HWS. Why is equivalence such an important part of the Brexit negotiations?
Well, I think this would be the basis upon which any future market access would be provided. Well, I suppose it could be important both in the context of the no deal cliff edge risk solutions, which is what Chris was just talking about for UK CCPs, where equivalence there would enable UK CCPs to continue to serve as effectively EU27 clearing members. It will also be important going forward for market access from UK-based firms, which currently do a lot of business cross-border into the EU27, while firms are setting up, a number of firms are setting up or increasing their presence in the EU to mitigate the end of passporting under the single market. There will still be a significant amount of activity done from the UK, and it's also important to ensure that EU27 firms can also interact with firms globally around the world. So I think that will continue to be a key area of discussion. We've seen quite a bit of focus on that already through various live files in Europe as to how they will want to look at this going forward. But I think the actual negotiation with the UK will not formally take place until the UK is left.
Thank you.
Chris,
yes, of course.
I think it's very interesting. If you look at the recent example of the Swiss in Switzerland, so we have the EU granted equivalence for effectively allowing execution of deals in shares to take place on US exchanges and some other countries' exchanges without any sort of time limit on that. But with respect to Switzerland, it put a 1-year time limit on, which expires at the end of this year. And why did it do that? Because the Commission is seeking to use equivalence decisions that weaponize, in this jargon which has emerged, weaponize equivalence decisions as a negotiating tool in a wider, for wider trade or economic purposes. In that case, to put pressure on the Swiss to agree their proposed framework agreement, which regulates the agreement between themselves. So we can see that equivalence decisions can become quite political, and particularly that they're not just technical issues around access. They're used to put pressure on market parties, on countries to agree all sorts of things. And they're also political in another sense, because as we've seen, there's spillover from the changes of the Commission's approach, which was generated by its response to the UK and Switzerland, on other countries. So we've seen this fall over with the US authorities being very concerned about the EU's new approach to equivalence, more restrictive approach to equivalence, and how that's going to affect American CCPs and other market infrastructures, or indeed possibly wider still. So equivalence has sort of moved from being this sort of neutral sort of thing which people talked about as being, you know, just a means of access, of sorting out some sort of minor problems, this wider political tool. And you know, so we have definitely not heard the last of it, and we will hear a lot more over the coming months and years.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of the session, and I've just got a couple more questions that have come in. Arvid, perhaps you just tell us, there's a question about the sort of publications that AFME has produced. Are they available, and can people access those?
Absolutely, Simon. So we published, I think, about 11 publications on Brexit. The first one, I think, was even before the referendum took place. Most recently, we have one on contract continuity and MREL eligibility, I think, of debt. If you want to access them, you can simply go on our website and click on key issues Brexit, and there you go.
Thank you. And the last question is to the whole panel, but I suspect it may be Michael who is the one who wants to answer this, which is, I think there's a little trick in this question, which is, who does the panel think the next Prime Minister will be?
If I had
there's a little trick in here, I think.
Well, I don't know what the trick is, but I'd say if I had to place a bet, be it £5 or £500, my money would go on Jeremy Hunt. And I'll cheat, my second choice would be Dominic Raab.
And I'm not sure whether Chris or Oliver wish to add any comment to that. Thank you all very much. Thank you for those of you who were able to join the webinar. I do apologise again for the technical glitches with the slides. I can reassure you that the slides will all be available, as will a full recording of the call. A big thank you to Chris Bates and Michael Prescott, and to Oliver and to Arvid. It was a really excellent and timely discussion. I'm not sure we answered all your questions or all the conundrum, but one thing is certain, at least we'll know by the end of today UK time whether Theresa May is still the British Prime Minister. Thank you and good afternoon, good night.